The law office in downtown Philadelphia felt like a mausoleum dressed up in mahogany and faded glory. The air was heavy with the smell of old files, ancient grievances, and whatever cologne the lawyer thought was a respectable. I sat across from my sister, Megan, influencer, trend chaser, and the kind of woman who lived for an audience, even when there wasn't one. To her, family meant supporting characters for her highlight reel. Her phone glimmered in her lap, always ready to catch a new angle. My uniform coat lay folded on my knees, a sharp contrast to her sculpted designer look. The lawyer, Mr. Wallace, cleared his throat with practiced solemnity. He'd probably done this speech so many times he could recite it in his sleep. As per your father's will, any heir who brings public shame or emotional instability to the Reed family name will forfeit their entire inheritance. I felt the old chill settle deep in my bones, colder than any bivouac night at Fort Bragg. I didn't need to look at Megan to know she was enjoying this. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the smallest triumphant curl of her mouth. That same look she'd had when she forgot in my 16th birthday. The same smirk when she convinced Dad that her networking trip to LA was a better investment than my rock scholarship fund. This wasn't a legal clause. It was the last tally in a lifelong ledger of betrayals. A week later, I found myself standing in the silence of a memorial chapel in Chestnut Hill, that sweet, cloying smell of lilies and regret hanging in the air. My father's passing brought out every extended relative from Maine to Georgia, all squeezing my hand and murmuring platitudes they didn't mean. Megan, of course, was front and center at the lectern, her tears carefully calculated for effect, her dress just severe enough to signal grief but not enough to look unflattering on Instagram Live. She spoke of loyalty and family, her voice trembling in a way I knew was rehearsed. But every word she said landed like a poisoned dart. That was always so concerned about those who drifted away, as she said, her eyes flicking pointedly in my direction, those who get lost in their own worlds. It was then that my phone vibrated sharply in my palm, an insistent little warning I felt more than heard. I slid my hand under the pew to check. One line. Don't react. Megan is recording you. Sent by Captain Jason Carter, my husband, my confidant, and the only person in that chapel who knew me beyond my uniform or my family history. I looked up and saw it, a tiny red recording light peeking out from behind the lectern, Megan's phone angled just right. For a second, I almost laughed. Of course she was streaming the memorial. Of course. I put on the calm, practiced smile I'd worn through 100 briefings and 1,000 long deployments. My mind snapped into another mode entirely. My gaze swept the room, not with fear, but with purpose. I found, without trying, the faces of 3 men in civilian suits, scattered among the mourners. Their posture, their eyes, their steady hands told me what Megan would never know. They were my people. Jason's people. Members of the 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers, blending in among the regulars, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. My fingers moved, deliberate and careful, across my phone screen. I typed a single 5-letter code. Raven. It was the contingency we'd set in motion after that ugly scene at the lawyer's office. Because for women like me, women who spent their lives defending their country but not always their own worth at home, sometimes you had to call in a little backup. Seconds later, those 3 men rose to their feet in unison, along with 9 more scattered throughout the chapel. The room shifted, the kind of tension that made your skin prickle. They said nothing, made no threats, simply stood. Then, as one, they turned and looked at me. A wave of silence swept the room. Meghan faltered, her fake tears drying up as she saw the atmosphere change. I watched, not with anger or even satisfaction, but a kind of clarity. For years, she'd written the script. This was the first time she realized someone else had picked up the pen. In that moment, the hierarchy that ruled my family, the unspoken rules, their golden child and the black sheep, all the old injuries, cracked. Meghan wanted a performance. What she got was an audience she couldn't control. She stood there, jaw slack, mask slipping. I let the quiet fill the space. It felt powerful. Not aggressive, just absolute. My men stood at attention, not for me as a Meghan's unstable sister, but for me as a leader. A woman in uniform. A person who'd spent her life earning loyalty the hard way. That was when I understood something. Meghan hadn't just underestimated me. She'd misunderstood everything I was. To understand why that moment at the memorial felt so much bigger than a family squabble, you'd have to know what it means to live a double life. For me, it started long before my father's will, maybe the first time I wore combat boots to Thanksgiving, or when I came home from Afghanistan and realized my family still saw me as just a Meghan's weird little sister. A year before Dad died, there was a family dinner in his old colonial in Germantown. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary chicken and too many old resentments. Dad raised his glass with pride I hadn't seen since my West Point graduation, which he'd nearly skipped for a corporate retreat in Miami. To my brilliant daughter, the entrepreneur, he said, clinking his glass with Meghan's. Landing that national campaign with Glow Up Fitness is just the start. Real business acumen. Meghan smiled and soaked up the applause, her Instagram stories no doubt already spinning the moment into 1,000 likes. She didn't really have a business. She had an aesthetic, a collection of partnerships with wellness brands, and a following that worshipped her #Monday motivation posts. I waited, quietly, for the applause to fade. Some stubborn, hopeful part of me, the piece that survived war zones and long deployments, decided to try. That's wonderful, Meg, I said with a smile. And I have some news, too. My article on counterinsurgency strategies was just published in the Journal of Homeland Security Studies. The table fell silent. Dad turned to me, his pride smile transforming into something more patient, almost patronizing. He patted my hand as if to reassure a small child. That's nice, Emily, he said. All that writing in your government job keeps you busy, I'm sure. It was a dismissal dressed up as encouragement. Not just in that moment, but in 100 small ways. The science fair trophies that went unmentioned, the debates he never attended, the medals tucked away in drawers instead of displayed in the living room. Meghan twisted the knife with a soft, practiced laugh. Oh, that's adorable. Still doing your little analyst thing? The table chuckled, and I shrank into myself, into the role they'd written for me, the quiet one, either the overachiever who was somehow always less impressive than the family's rising star. After dinner, as I cleared the plates, Mom caught me in the kitchen. She believed in family peace at any cost, especially if the cost was my pride. Emily, sweetheart, you know how your sister is. Her life is so public. She needs support. Your work, well, it's complicated. Not everyone understands it. Don't make things difficult. Just let her have the spotlight, okay? In that moment, I realized she wasn't asking for kindness. She was asking for invisibility. Now, picture a very different room. No sunlight, no laughter, just the low hum of electronics and the metallic tang of recycled air. This was a classified meeting room at SOCOM headquarters in Tampa, Florida, a place where secrets are currency and every word matters. 12 men in tactical gear, all part of Jason's team, sat at attention. Here, I wasn't a Megan's sister or the odd one out. Here, I was Captain Emily Carter, Senior Threat Analyst, and the woman whose briefings kept people alive. I stood in front of a glowing digital map, pointing out insurgency hot zones and outlining the latest intel on enemy comms. Enemy TTPs in this region have shifted, I explained, tracing a border with my laser pointer. They're baiting units into public-facing incidents. The threat isn't just kinetic, it's informational. Stay off unsecured comms, stick to encrypted bursts, and be prepared for psychological ops. Nobody patted my hand or told me my work was acute. Here, my words were lore. Operators who could change the balance of power in a country hung on every detail I gave them. Jason, my husband, but in this room, just another leader, nodded from the side. Questions? He asked. Possible local collaborators? Civilian pattern changes? I answered every one, clear and direct. There was no room for doubt. In that room, my mind wasn't a hobby, it was the shield between these men and the worst day of their lives. Living those two lives felt like psychological whiplash. At home, I was a footnote. At work, I was the authority. My family's hierarchy shrank me, but the military relied on my judgment. For years, I played along. I laughed at the jokes, let Megan have the spotlight, and kept my work locked behind classified clearance. But after my father's will, after that cold clause designed to cut me out, I realized something. They hadn't just dismissed my career. They'd mistaken my professionalism for weakness. And Megan, with all her staged photos and carefully curated moments, had just become a threat. Not the kind you meet on the battlefield, but the kind you outmaneuver with strategy and patience. That night, the anger faded, replaced by focus. I sat across from Jason at our kitchen table, a spreadsheet of family dynamics and timelines open between us. Megan wants to provoke a reaction, I said, voice flat, clinical. She'll use the memorial as a stage. She's hoping to catch me off guard and make me look unstable. If I give her anything, she'll use it to disinherit me. Jason's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. He knew the drill. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was an operation. We set our strategy like any other mission. Jason, ever the tactician, started working his channels. He didn't just ask for favors from friends, that would have left a trail. Instead, he filed a formal request with SOCOM for an honor guard at my father's memorial, citing Dad's brief stint with the National Guard back in the 80s. Officially, it was a gesture of respect for his service. Unofficially, it gave us the perfect cover. While Jason handled logistics, I focused on analysis, my weapon of choice. Megan wasn't some random adversary. I'd spent years watching her, learning her patterns, her needs, the ways she twisted reality to suit herself. She craved control, thrived on narrative. The eulogy would be her stage, and she'd escalate from subtle digs to something more aggressive. I mapped it out the same way I'd break down an insurgent cell's behavior. Likely provocations, calling out my distance from the family, hinting at instability, maybe even using my military career against me. Primary objective, catch me on camera reacting. Secondary objective, convince the extended family that I wasn't fit to inherit. With the threat clearly defined, I built the countermeasure. I briefed Jason and his team leader, Master Sergeant Carter, who'd seen more operations than most people could imagine. The Raven protocol is simple, EI said, pacing our living room like it was a command center. On my signal, your team stands. You turn your focus to me. No words, no movement forward. The goal is not to threaten. It's to seize psychological initiative, to disrupt Megan's sense of control. As soon as she realizes she's lost the room, her plan fails. They listened, not with pity, but with the quiet respect that comes from trusting someone's judgment. For the first time, I felt lighter, like the loneliness that had weighed me down in my family for years was beginning to shift. Invitations for the memorial went out. Megan was thrilled by the prospect of a large audience. More eyes meant a bigger moment for her, more drama to exploit. She had no idea that buried among the guests would be 12 men trained to move as a single unit, men who dismantled regimes with less planning than this. She thought she was writing the script. She never realized she was just an actor in someone else's operation. The chapel itself felt more like a stage set for a tragedy than a place of mourning. I'd attended enough memorials, military and civilian, to recognize the difference. This wasn't about grief, it was about performance. Megan arrived dressed in designer black, every detail curated. She arranged her phone carefully on the lectern, lens pointed at the first pew, at me. Her eulogy started off syrupy sweet, all about a devotion to family. I kept my face neutral, mind tracking her voice for shifts in tone. Then, right on cue, her language shifted. They'd always valued family above all else, as she said, glancing at the crowd, then zeroing in on me. He worried about those who drift away, forgetting who they are. The words were daggers, each meant to draw blood without leaving a mark. But I was ready. She took it further. It's always tragic when someone chooses a life so dazzling, so different from the values they were raised with. Sometimes, they forget their own roots. That was it, the public accusation, the moment she'd been building to. I felt my phone vibrate in my hand. A message from Jason. She's live streaming to a private group. Execute now. A deep, cold calm washed over me. All the years of being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed, every quiet humiliation, came together in that single moment of action. I typed the code word, Raven. The effect was instant. 12 men rose to their feet, their movements perfectly synchronized. The sound of suits and shoes in unison was louder than any shout. Conversation died mid-whisper, replaced by an uneasy silence. Heads turned. Faces went from confused to alarmed. They weren't looking at Megan or at the casket. Every single one fixed their gaze directly on me. They stood, not as a threat, but as a silent wall of honor, awaiting orders. Megan's voice faltered. For the first time, I saw real fear cross her face, as if she'd just realized the game had changed and she wasn't in control anymore. She tried to keep talking, but the words came out broken, stammered, and unfinished. Her phone, meant to capture my humiliation, was now recording her own unraveling. She wasn't the director. She was the subject. My mother, sitting 3 rows behind, looked at me with something like awe, and maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of understanding. The rest of the family sat frozen, staring between me and the silent honor guard, the old hierarchy dissolving in front of them. For once, Megan's attempts at power meant nothing. She'd created a moment of public shame, but for herself, not for me. After Megan fled the lectern, a heavy silence settled over the room. She managed to mumble the last lines of her speech, but her composure was gone. The rest of the service went by in a blur. Jason's team stayed standing, a living shield of respect. People came up to offer condolences, but there was a new tone in their voices, something close to respect and surprise. Across the room, Megan huddled with her allies, completely isolated. Their angry whispers bounced off the invisible wall formed by Jason's men. There were no confrontations, no scenes. Just quiet defeat. They left early, slipping out a side door. There was no victory lap. No final performance. Just retreat. The war was over, and I hadn't fired a single shot. 3 months passed. The dust from the memorial settled. The old family order had fractured, irreparably, it seemed. Megan vanished from my life, dropping all contact but the occasional bitter subtweet. My mother stopped calling for a while, unsure how to bridge a gap she'd helped create. But for me, something had shifted. I found myself, for the first time, building a life that felt real, on my own terms, not the ones handed to me by legacy or obligation. It started with the work. After the operation at the memorial, something changed at headquarters. I wasn't just the quiet analyst anymore, I was the guest speaker, the subject matter expert everyone wanted in the room. The confidence I'd built in the army, honed by real-world chaos, not family drama, became my shield. I spoke at briefings on hybrid threats and resilience, ran tabletop exercises for new officers, and even started mentoring young women trying to break into military intelligence. But nothing hit quite as hard as the day I got the call from my old professor at Penn. "We'd love you to guest lecture for our graduate seminar on security strategy. You have real experience, Emily, not just theory." The next week, I stood in a university auditorium, sunlight streaming through tall windows. My name, Captain Emily Carter, was up on the big screen. The room was full of eager, sharp students. I talked about asymmetric warfare and the human side of threat analysis. They listened, really listened, scribbling notes, firing off insightful questions, and even challenging some of my points. For the first time in years, my voice felt valued not because of who I married, but for what I knew. That night, walking home through Rittenhouse Square, the city buzzing and alive, I felt a peace I'd only ever known in fleeting moments. I realized I'd built a legacy for myself, one no one could take away. On Saturday, I threw a backyard cookout at our house in West Philly. Jason manned the grill, flipping burgers and teasing the guys from his team about their grilling techniques. Their wives and kids filled the backyard with laughter and chatter, transforming our space from an outpost into a real home. For once, I didn't feel like I was on guard. I wasn't the captain or the black sheep. I was just Emily, friend, neighbor, and maybe, finally, part of something real. The men from the memorial were there too. But there were no suits, no salutes, just t-shirts, bad jokes, and competitive cornhole. Even their families felt like mine. I realized then, this was my family now. A patchwork built not by blood, but by shared sacrifice, respect, and trust. During a lull, Jason wandered over with a cold lemonade and a grin. "You look like you're plotting something," he joked. "Not plotting," I said. "Just grateful." He smiled. "You earned this." Later, as the sun went down and the fireflies came out, my phone buzzed. A message from Megan. It was long, rambling, full of half-hearted apologies. She wrote about his stress, about how she had never meant things to go that far. She asked questions about the estate, about details, about money. The old script. For a moment, I felt that familiar tug, the urge to fix, to answer, to explain. But then I remembered the years of being made small, the months of rebuilding myself from scratch. I showed Jason the message. He just raised an eyebrow. I shook my head, then pressed the archive. The conversation vanished. I finally understood. My peace was no longer negotiable. The next morning, I sat on our porch with a mug of coffee, watching the world wake up. The quiet felt earned, like the medals tucked away in my drawer, or the soft laughter echoing from the night before. I thought about legacy, about what it meant to truly belong somewhere. My family had always believed legacy was something you inherited, something you fought over in stuffy lawyers' offices and played out in toxic power struggles. But I'd learned that real legacy was the respect you earned in the rooms you chose to be in. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I wasn't a supporting character in Megan's story. I was the author of my own. A few weeks after the cookout, life slipped into a new kind of normal. My mornings started with a run through the city, the weight of old memories replaced by the rhythm of sneakers on concrete and the sound of traffic waking up around me. Each day, I returned home to Jason making breakfast, sometimes pancakes, sometimes just strong coffee and a smile. These small routines felt like victory laps after so many years spent navigating other people's expectations. At work, my role continued to shift. The higher-ups at SOCOM began inviting me to think tanks and leadership seminars, asking for my perspective not just as an analyst, but as a veteran of both war and family politics. I started consulting on a new initiative, helping develop resilience programs for soldiers returning from deployment. It was a project close to my heart. I'd seen too many good people struggle in silence, never realizing their worth outside the mission. One afternoon, after a particularly long strategy session, I found myself sitting in my office, reviewing case files. The desk was littered with coffee mugs and briefing folders, but my attention kept drifting. My phone chimed, a reminder about the annual Reed Family Foundation dinner. I stared at it for a moment. Last year, I'd skipped it entirely, feigning a deployment. This year, there was no excuse. Jason found me lost in thought. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from me. "You owe them nothing." "I know," I replied. "But maybe I owe it to myself to show up, not for them, but for me." The dinner was held at a sprawling country club outside the city, a place I'd always found both beautiful and suffocating. The Reed family crest glimmered above the door, a relic from generations before. As I walked in, the room went quiet. Old relatives eyed me warily, remembering the spectacle at the memorial. Megan was nowhere in sight, but her absence felt as heavy as her presence. My mother greeted me with a fragile smile, her hands fluttering nervously. "Emily, I'm glad you came," she whispered. "We've missed you." The meal unfolded in a predictable way, toasts to the family legacy, polite small talk, sideways glances in my direction. But there was an undertone of curiosity now, a sense that the story had changed. Cousins asked about my work with veterans, aunts pressed for details on my latest lectures. The same people who once dismissed me now seemed unsure where I fit. Midway through dessert, the conversation shifted to the estate. My uncle, a man who prided himself on being the family's unofficial historian, brought it up. It's good to see the family together, he intoned, even after a challenging year. Your father would have been proud of how everyone handled things. The will, of course, was clear, but sometimes clarity is a double-edged sword. I met his gaze, steady and calm. My father wanted to leave a legacy, I said. I think we all get to decide what that means for us. There was a beat of silence. Then, surprisingly, my mother spoke up. Emily's work keeps people safe. That's a legacy too. For the first time, I felt a flicker of belonging, not because of tradition, but because I'd earned it. After the dinner, I stepped out onto the club's stone terrace. The night air was crisp, stars scattered across the sky. My mother followed, arms wrapped around herself. She stood next to me for a long moment before speaking. I know I haven't always understood you, as she said softly. But I want to. I'm sorry for the times I asked you to shrink yourself. I let the words settle. Years ago, I might have brushed them off or tried to smooth things over. Now, I simply nodded. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. We stood together in the quiet, not as mother and daughter divided by old expectations, but as two women learning to see each other clearly. When I got home that night, Jason was waiting up for me, reading on the couch. He set his book aside as I walked in. How was it? Not easy, I admitted, but not awful, either. He smiled. That's progress. I thought of the countless battles I'd fought, overseas, in briefing rooms, around dinner tables. Sometimes, winning isn't about defeating the other side. Sometimes, it's about refusing to give up on yourself. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that the war over my family's legacy was finally over. Not because I'd claimed some prize, but because I'd learned to value my own story. And in the peace that followed, I finally found the freedom to move forward. Summer arrived in Philadelphia, transforming the city into a patchwork of open windows, block parties, and the hum of air conditioners. My life, which had once revolved around proving myself in conference rooms and war zones, now settled into a quieter, steadier rhythm. I volunteered for extra duty with local rock cadets on weekends, leading leadership hikes and sharing what the Army had taught me about resilience, and, more importantly, about starting over. I still hadn't heard from Megan, and, in truth, I wasn't sure what I'd say if I did. Her absence left a hole I hadn't expected, not longing or regret, but something like relief, mixed with curiosity. Had she learned anything? Did she ever replay the scene at the memorial in her head, wondering what might have been different if she'd seen me as a person and not a rival? Sometimes, I caught myself scrolling her social media, seeing her world through filtered photos and inspirational captions. The audience was still there, the followers still cheering. But every post felt just a little more forced, the shine slightly faded. One afternoon, as I finished up a training run along the Schuylkill River, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered out of habit. Emily? It's Megan. The sound of her voice was enough to stop me in my tracks. For a moment, all I could hear was the river and the rush of passing cars. Hey, Meg. I waited, cautious. Is everything okay? There was a long pause. Then, I don't know. I guess I miss you. I miss us. It's been weird, not talking. The vulnerability in her voice was new, unexpected. I found myself letting my guard down, just a little. Yeah, EI said. It has been weird. She hesitated, then pressed on. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About Dad, about the memorial, or about everything. I thought I was helping, protecting our name, or whatever. But I see now that I was just protecting myself. And I hurt you. I'm sorry, Emily. A strange mix of emotions bubbled up. I felt old anger, yes, but also relief, and something like hope. Thank you, Megan, I said softly. That means a lot. I'm still working through things, too. Maybe we can talk, really talk, sometime soon? I'd like that, she replied. Maybe we could meet up? Just us. No drama, no cameras, no family lawyers. I laughed, surprised at how easy it felt. Just us. I'd like that. We met at a coffee shop in Fishtown, a far cry from the country clubs and fancy brunches of our childhood. The place was crowded, loud, and messy in a way that made everything feel real. Megan arrived first, hair in a messy ponytail, no makeup, her phone nowhere in sight. We talked for hours. About Dad and the impossible expectations, about Mom's attempts at peacekeeping, about the ways we'd both felt invisible, me in the shadow of her spotlight, her in the pressure to keep shining. We admitted things we'd never said out loud, fears, regrets, even the moments we'd secretly envied each other. By the end, we weren't sisters at war. We were two women who had survived the same storm and finally found each other on the other side. Rebuilding trust didn't happen overnight. But we started small. A text here, a lunch there. No more big gestures or grand reconciliations, just honest conversation and, sometimes, silence. I let Megan in on the work I was doing with veterans. She started inviting me to her art shows, less about selling herself now, more about genuine connection. It struck me how different our lives had become, yet how much we still needed each other. We were finally carving out our own ground, separate from the past but not running from it. As the weeks rolled on, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just a gift you gave someone else. It was the ground you claimed for yourself, unburdened, unafraid, and open to what came next. I'd spent so long fighting for acceptance, for recognition, for a seat at the table. Now, for the first time, I saw that the table could be rebuilt. That sometimes, the greatest legacy is not what you inherit, but what you choose to make out of broken pieces. Fall swept through the city in a rush of golden leaves and brisk mornings. My career, which once felt like my only armor, now became a bridge, connecting me to people and places I'd overlooked. I worked with a nonprofit helping veterans transition into civilian life, teaching workshops on leadership and storytelling. For the first time, my army experience wasn't just something I defended. It was something I could use to lift others up. Megan, too, was changing. She signed up for a community art class and started volunteering at a local shelter. Her social media softened, fewer filters, more real life. Sometimes I'd see a post about our coffee shop meetups, tagged #sisters not rivals, and I'd smile, proud of both of us for getting this far. Our mother, noticing the shift, started reaching out more often. The three of us would have Sunday dinners at my place, sometimes awkward, sometimes surprisingly warm. We talked about everything: Dad's legacy, Mom's regrets, the years we'd lost to pride. For once, there was no pretense, no unspoken scoreboard. One Sunday, as we cleared plates, Mom lingered in the kitchen. I wish I'd done things differently, as she said, wiping her hands on a towel. I was so afraid of conflict. I let the wrong people take charge. I let you both feel alone. Megan reached over, squeezing her hand. We all made mistakes, Mom. But we're still here. I added, we can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. That's enough. The kitchen filled with quiet agreement, a kind of peace we'd never known. Late one night, Jason and I sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the city. Ever miss the old life? He asked, his voice gentle. I thought about it, the adrenaline, the danger, the clarity that came from knowing your mission. Sometimes. But I wouldn't trade this for anything. He smiled, lacing his fingers with mine. You built this, you know. You chose peace when you could have chosen war. I leaned against his shoulder, feeling the truth of it. For years, I believed power meant always being on guard, always outmaneuvering the people who hurt me. Now, I understood real strength was softer. It was choosing connection over combat, vulnerability over victory. A few weeks later, my work with veterans led to an unexpected honor. The university where I'd guest lectured invited me back, this time as an adjunct professor for the year. The offer was more than a job. It was proof that my story, messy, complicated, and sometimes painful, had value. On the first day of class, I looked out at my students, a mix of young hopefuls and grizzled vets, all hungry for something more. I told them about Afghanistan, about losing friends, about coming home and finding the hardest battles waiting at the dinner table, not the battlefield. I talked about Megan, about the power of forgiveness, about fighting for your place in the world, and about learning when to put down the sword. They listened. They took notes. A few even stayed after class, asking how to navigate their own families, their own ghosts. I realized, then, that I wasn't just teaching tactics or strategy. I was teaching how to start over. That night, Jason surprised me with a small celebration at home. Our backyard was strung with lights. The men from his team brought their families, their laughter filling the air. Even Megan showed up, arms full of homemade cupcakes. She joked about burning them, but confessed she'd wanted to make something from scratch. As dusk settled, I looked around at this odd, wonderful group, soldiers, artists, spouses, kids, and felt, for the first time, that I truly belonged. The life I'd built was messy, far from perfect, but it was real. Near the end of the night, Megan pulled me aside. I know we'll never go back to how things were, she said, voice soft, but I like this better. I like who we're becoming. Me too, I replied. We did this together. We hugged. No cameras, no audience, just two sisters, choosing peace. The battles I fought for acceptance, for visibility, for my place in the world, they weren't wasted. They brought me here, to this imperfect, extraordinary family. And as the night faded into laughter and stories, I knew. This was my legacy. Not the money or the name, but the bonds we rebuilt and the lives we touched, one moment, one choice at a time. Winter crept back into the city, slowing everything to a hush beneath the weight of early snow. The holiday season always carried its own memories for our family, good and bad. For years, I dreaded these months, bracing for old wounds to reopen with every invitation or empty chair. But this time, there was a different energy in the air. Megan invited us all to her apartment for Thanksgiving, a first. She'd always preferred restaurant reservations and high-gloss parties, but now she wanted home cooking and mismatched plates. I offered to bring my famous stuffing. Jason signed up for turkey duty. And Mom volunteered dessert. Megan, for once, focused on the guest list, making sure everyone felt welcome. The apartment filled with people, friends, neighbors, a few of Jason's teammates, and Megan's new friends from her art class. The night was loud, messy, and honest. There were awkward moments, small talk that fell flat, stories that stung a bit too much. But instead of covering over the discomfort, we let it sit. We talked about Dad, about the wildness of family, about the strange grace in getting a second chance. After dinner, Megan surprised everyone with a toast. She raised her glass, water, not wine, her eyes bright and steady. I used to think legacy was something you inherited, as she began. A name, money, a reputation. But I've learned it's about the stories you build and the people you choose. I'm grateful to have found my way back to my sister, my mom, and the friends who feel like family. Here's to messy love, to forgiveness, and to new beginnings. The room erupted in applause, laughter, and, yes, a few happy tears. Later that week, I received an unexpected email from a publisher. Someone had heard me speak at the university and wanted me to write a book. They thought my story, military, family, forgiveness, could help other women find their voice. I hesitated. The old voice in my head, the one shaped by years of being overlooked, whispered that my story was too small, too ordinary. But then I remembered every person who'd stayed after class, every veteran who'd shared their struggle, every sister who'd reached out across a divide. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about being extraordinary. Maybe it was about being real. I called Megan that night to tell her. She cheered so loudly she woke her neighbors. You have to do it, as she insisted. You owe it to all the women who need to know they're not alone. And for the first time, I believed her. Jason and I spent the holidays quietly, hosting a smaller Christmas Eve for friends who had nowhere else to go. We exchanged simple gifts, books, letters, inside jokes. My mother came by early with cinnamon rolls, Megan showed up in pajamas, and we spent the morning watching old movies and retelling favorite stories. No drama, no performances, just comfort. Afterward, Megan and I walked through the snowy streets, stopping at a little park near the river. We sat on a bench, bundled up against the cold. Remember how we used to fight over who got to put the star on the tree? Megan laughed, shaking her head. We were so stubborn. I grinned. Some things never change. She turned serious for a moment. Do you ever think about Dad? What he'd say if he saw us now? I paused. I think he'd be surprised. Maybe proud. But mostly, I think he'd realize we were stronger than he knew. That all the rules and traditions he tried to protect couldn't stop us from finding our own way. Megan nodded, tears bright in her eyes. I'm glad we did. The new year brought fresh opportunities. The university asked me to design a new course, one that blended security studies with personal leadership, trauma recovery, and resilience. I accepted, eager to pay forward what I'd learned. Megan's art was featured in a community gallery, her first real show. She invited the whole family, and I showed up front and center, cheering her on. There were hard days, too, old griefs, new doubts, the tug-of-war between past and present. But through it all, we kept choosing each other. We kept choosing family. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the quiet, thinking of the journey that brought me here. Not a perfect journey, but mine, a story of loss and courage, of anger and reconciliation, of learning to speak up and, sometimes, learning to let go. And in that silence, I knew I had become the kind of woman I once needed. Strong enough to stand alone, but wise enough to know when to reach for help. Spring returned to Philadelphia with the promise of something new, a city waking up, families emerging from hibernation, 1,000 tiny possibilities opening up again. I watched the world bloom from my porch, coffee in hand, reflecting on how far I'd come. Legacy, I realized, isn't a thing you inherit. It's a decision you make, day after day, with the people you choose to love. My book proposal turned into a contract. The process of writing became its own kind of therapy. I spent long nights at my desk, pouring out old memories, some raw, some redeemed. I wrote about Afghanistan, about military life, but mostly about coming home to a world that didn't know what to do with a woman who wore medals and scars both. I wrote about Megan, about battles that couldn't be fought with strategy or rank, but with empathy, forgiveness, and the slow rebuilding of trust. The first draft wasn't pretty. It was messy, honest, sometimes funny, sometimes furious. But with every chapter, the burden of my old family story lifted. The voices that had made me feel small, the doubts, the old wounds, began to quiet. In their place came a new sense of belonging, a new kind of pride. Megan became my biggest supporter. She read every page, scribbling notes in the margins, texting late at night. This part made me cry. Can I steal this line for my next art piece? I'm so proud of you, M. Her own life grew in parallel. Her art show was a hit, drawing people from all over the city. She was featured in a local magazine, her work described as a bold, vulnerable, and full of heart. The same words, I realized, that once felt like weaknesses in our family were now her greatest strengths. Mom joined us for Sunday dinners, her laughter filling the kitchen, her old anxieties slowly giving way to joy. The three of us, once separated by years of miscommunication and grief, found a rhythm. We still disagreed, sometimes fiercely. But now, our arguments ended with hugs, not silence. That summer, the university invited me to give the commencement address. I stood in front of hundreds of graduates, some in uniform, some in bright, hopeful caps and gowns. I spoke about courage, about choosing integrity when it's hard, about redefining strength not as domination, but as connection. I saw Megan and Mom in the front row, both teary, both beaming. When I finished, the applause felt like sunlight. Afterward, a young woman in army rot approached me. Do you ever regret it? All the fighting, for respect, for your place in the world? I considered her question, the old echoes of my father's disapproval and Megan's rivalry drifting through my mind. Sometimes I regret how much I let it hurt me, I told her honestly. But I don't regret fighting. I just learned the fight was never about defeating my family, it was about finding my own worth. And helping others find theirs, too. She smiled. Thank you. That's what I needed to hear. The book was published that fall. The launch event was small but warm, a room filled with friends, former students, veterans, and family. Jason stood at my side, always my anchor. Megan set up a display of her latest artwork, inspired by our journey. Mom, proud and emotional, read the first chapter aloud for the crowd. As she finished, She squeezed my hand. I always knew you'd find your way, she said quietly. I just wish I'd seen you sooner. I hugged her, feeling the old ache replaced by gratitude. We see each other now. That's what matters. Years from now, no one will remember how much money changed hands, who wore what to the funeral, or even who was named in the will. What they'll remember, what will last, are the choices we made when it mattered. The moments we chose kindness over pride, forgiveness over stubbornness, love over fear. I walk through the city now with a sense of peace I never had before. My medals still hang in my study, reminders of a different battlefield, but my real victories are here. In my students who find their voices. In my sister's art. In the laughter that fills my home. In the family I built, both born and chosen. Legacy isn't what you're given. It's what you leave behind in the hearts you touch, the stories you help others tell, the peace you fight for in your own life. And that, finally, is enough.